Okay, so Chapter 10, Wetlands, Endangered Species, and the Public Trust. We're going to talk a lot about the public trust, common resources, and the Endangered Species Act and how they relate. And the chapter covers these pretty well. And you'll notice the chapters aren't specifically devoted for one statute versus another. And I kind of like that. Some of these textbooks that cover environmental law are very dry, very boring, and very complex. And this textbook really kind of just summarizes everything in a more simplistic way of reading it. So I like this chapter. I like what's in it. And I'll probably have several lectures on this one as well. This is where I have most of my experience, and so I tend to get a little bit more into it. So I'm going to summarize a little bit the historical perspective of the public trust, essentially, and the violation of the public trust. And we'll start with early settlers. And so some of this is going to be review from the beginning of the semester, but early settlers and colonizers and westward expansion and all of that, there wasn't much of an environmental ethic, which was the term was coined by Aldo Leopold, and he coined that term because of the response of the environment to westward expansion, that there needs to be some type of land ethic or environmental ethic. But there was, excessive forest decline and fishery collapse and pollution, wetland decline. Over 50% of the wetlands in the United States were filled in. 15% soil depletion, declining aquifers, the loss of the Great Plains. Bison, which roamed the Great Plains by the millions, nearly went extinct. They're doing okay now, but they were literally hunted to extinction. Their habitat was converted to agriculture land. You can imagine the Native Americans that relied on bison herds to see them disappear. Must have been pretty tragic. These guys are standing on a pile of bison skulls. And this illustration here is not an exaggeration. There used to be for recreation, essentially, they would drive out amongst these herds, and hunters would get out and just shoot the bison. They just shoot them dead, and most of them would lay there and rot. And just very bizarre mentality, and that mentality has now largely disappeared, as we've discussed earlier. The overfishing of Atlantic cod and the subsequent collapse of the cod fishery is beginning to, it's recovering now, but it's not anything like it used to be historical. There were so many cod, so abundant, that your harvest would look like this. Those days are just gone. This is the tragedy of the commons, right? And examples like this, these are two gentlemen in Yellowstone National Park fishing in the late 1800s. Yellowstone became a national park in 1872, and it was managed by the military, actually. It managed the national parks, and there was actually an effort to extend national park management to the military and other national parks later in the early 1900s because it was so effective, but they felt that the militarization of the national park was not a good idea. So now we have the National Park Service. But these gentlemen, if you look on this rock here, these are all Yellowstone cutthroat trout laid out on this rock. There's probably over 100 of them there. And these guys are standing here with just makeshift fishing poles, fishing for them, just catching and keeping every frickin' fish that they catch with just no comprehension of releasing them or to just stop fishing when you have enough to feed your family. I can't imagine there are 100 people waiting back at camp to be fed by all these fish. I would guess most of these fish would rot and go bad. There's no coolers with ice in it waiting for them. These fish are going to go bad before they ever get consumed. But there was just this mentality of, shooting things and letting them die, catching things and not using them. It was just a weird mentality that's largely disappeared. And now, there's a much more ethical approach, and there's regulations. The state regulates this because they hold Fish and Wildlife in trust for you and I. That's the public trust doctrine that we discussed earlier in the semester. And they have the responsibility, the profound responsibility, to ensure that this type of behavior doesn't happen. These two guys are violating the public trust. The fish in this lake belong to everybody, and they are really just picking them out of here, as if there's an infinite supply. Um, fish and wildlife management agencies with the states are designed. Their purpose is to prevent the violation of the public trust. So these things don't happen anymore. But let's talk a little bit more about the public trust doctrine. This idea that the states hold in trust resources for you and I, right? Particularly fish and wildlife, but also by extension, water, air, forests. All of these things are things that we have a right to. They're common resources, right? And they're part of this public trust. Somebody needs to be protecting those things for the good of not just two dudes with makeshift fishing poles, but the entire population. This concept emerged way back in Justinian Rome in 527 to 565 AD, when he declared that the emperor declared that the area between high and low tide belongs to everybody. That everybody, even the common folk, had the right to access that area, as well as the ocean in general. And the Magna Carta in 1215 in England, King John signed the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta was designed to limit the king's power, and part of it, there was actually part of it that opened up the rivers to everyone. They were choked with industrial complexes and boats and all sorts of things, and it was causing such a problem that part of the limiting the power's king, the king's power in the Magna Carta, was opening up the rivers to everybody. And then, of course, the Constitution, our Constitution, limits government power as well considerably and spreads it out amongst three equal branches and protects individuals' power. It's the first document in which there were not only aspects that protect the greater good, but there are aspects that protect individual rights, and that's the Bill of Rights. And so this led to all sorts of court cases in the 1900s, late 1800s and early 1900s, that led to this idea that some resources can belong to everybody, and that somebody needs to be protecting these resources for the greater good. And I posted that Tragedy of the Commons video again, the little cartoon video. I think it's a great little video, so you can watch that again if you'd like to. So it wasn't until 1970 when a law professor from University of California, Berkeley Law School named Dr. Joe Sachs published a paper regarding entitled "The Public Trust," and he termed this relationship that of the public trust, and used some evidence, from Justinian Rome and the Magna Carta, even though those were very crude, and I don't mean to make it look like Justinian was this great guy or King John was this great guy. There were plenty of problems going on there, but this is where these ideas began to emerge in society. And in 1970, Joe Sachs brought the idea of the public trust into the mainstream conversation. And state governments really ran with this, and there was a number of legal cases that sided with this, that there are things that belong to everybody, and the states are required to manage this for you, and protect this for you, including the federal government. So state governments hold navigable waterways, for example, tidelands, and fish and wildlife in trust for the public. And then there's been lots of attempts to extend the public trust into land, soil, air, national parks, water, and so forth. And in fact, the Clean Water Act, Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, defines, and we've talked about this, navigable waters, or the waters of the United States as navigable waters. And the Commerce Clause protects this. So it does, even the waterways don't belong to Kentucky or West Virginia, they belong to the United States and all the citizens of the United States. So you can go out and I'm doing that this summer. I'm going fly fishing in Montana and Wyoming and Idaho, and you can go out. Even though I'm a resident of Massachusetts, I can go out to Montana or Wyoming to public land out there, and I can go hiking. I can park wherever I want to, and I can hike wherever I want to. It's public land. I can do that. I can access all of the streams out there, and I can go fly fishing and not worry about getting in trouble for trespassing. That's a pretty cool concept. And that's part of this public trust, and it's defined in regards to access to waterways under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, and is also protected under the River and Harbors Act of 1899. Now, there are exceptions to that navigable water access law in Massachusetts, Kentucky, West Virginia, I think. Oh, and there's another one. I can't remember which the other one is. Anyway, those are the commonwealths. They're states, of course, but they're also referred to as commonwealths. They carry with them some old English law, and it's kind of weird. And what happens is you have the right to access any waterway between the high water marks on both banks. You can walk any waterway that's considered a navigable waterway. That's part of the public trust that belongs to you. However, in the commonwealths like Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, maybe definitely Kentucky, and West Virginia, in these commonwealths, you can access the water, but you can't touch the bottom. The bottom can be owned privately by landowners. And so, for example, there was a stream here in Massachusetts where I was accessing for fish sampling purposes, and they had no trespassing signs in the middle of the stream. Now, if I was out west, I would take those signs and rip them up and throw them away, because that's against the law. You can't tell somebody you can't access a stream. However, knowing the law in Massachusetts, if I was on a boat, I could boat right through there and it's not trespassing. But the stream was so small that wasn't possible. And wading, by touching the bottom of the stream, I was violating that no trespassing request by the landowners. That needs to change. This Commonwealth crap is stupid in regards to navigable waterways and who can own what in regards to the bottom of a waterway. It's just really dumb. It's antiquated. It needs to end, and it's just pathetic. Anyway, that's my personal opinion there with that. So a key case came out of this: Illinois Central Railroad Company versus Illinois. Oh, I forgot the date. It's 1869. What had happened was a railroad company purchased land from the state of Illinois so that they could move the railroad along the coast of Lake Michigan, and then they purchased land under Lake Michigan so that they could make a harbor. It'd be very convenient, for ships coming in with supplies. They could load and unload right directly to the railroad. And the state was all for this. They sold them. They were going to sell them the land, but then the state changed their mind, and the state said, no, that land under the water actually belongs to everybody, and we can't just sell that land. Now, it's possible that they can. They just decided not to under the conclusion that it belonged to the people at large, and it wasn't in their interest to do that. So the railroad company sued the state of Illinois over this 1,000 acres under Lake Michigan that was given to them. So the courts sided with Illinois and said, no, actually, the states hold in trust for the people all the land under a navigable waterway. So not only does the water, which they had already concluded belongs to the people, but so does the land underneath the waterway, again, except for these few commonwealths. And so the court sided with the state, and the state kept that land. And these court cases, each court case sets a precedence for the next court case and the next one and the next one. And so they didn't use the public trust term at this time. That didn't exist till the 1970s, but it was beginning to emerge, this idea of the public trust. And in 1970, when that paper was published by Joe Sachs, that was kind of the kicker. a lot of these court cases from the past were evidence of this.